Welcome to Mysteries of Superstition Mountain. I'm Larry Hedrick, where we bring the past into the present for our future viewers. Today we have another great story by Hank Sheffer.
Well, as you'll recall, the last show that we did, we talked about Bigfoot. And at that time I said that Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains had a tendency to talk about history or talk about legends and lore. And sometimes we even got right out there with some of the fantastical things that may or may not have happened in the mountain. In this particular case, we're going to tell another one of those fantastical stories. But as one of the fellows mentioned back on the Bigfoot piece, he wasn't real happy with talking about Tom Bisconte, because Tom Bisconte had built himself a set of circumstances that weren't all that favorable to what he was doing. And consequently, he never had anything that backed up what he said. And that's why he wasn't the focus of that show. In this case, we're going to be talking about another fella who told a story by the name of Richard Bud Lane. And Richard Bud Lane was an old cowboy from out here. I met Bud years ago, just before he died. I'd gotten back here in '81, and he died in '87. But he was a cowboy's cowboy. People liked him, they trusted him, they knew him. He worked with a lot of the other ranchers who were out here. There were a lot of them. Floyd Stone, there was, of course, Gus Barkley, and some of the others that were out here, and they were running cattle. That was really happening in the '80s. So at any rate, Bud Lane had a story that he told, and what I'm going to do is tell that story by reading it pretty much, because it's what he said. Bud Lane had a reputation for telling the truth. He told some tall tales, but he also had a tendency to tell the truth more often than not, and when he told you something was, you could bank on it. So this is a story that he told, and this is why we call this story the incident at Dogie Springs. We were all headed with a group of riders to the Rivas Ranch from Floyd Stone's IV Ranch. As we rounded Inspiration Point, we could look down into the vast emptiness of Fish Creek Canyon. At the same time, we saw a brilliant meteor tracking north to south across the clear evening sky. In fact, it was so bright that the light was reflected off of Castle Dome Peak. And it's interesting now, if you all want to go and look these up, you can, and you'll find them on the maps. They're all marked, so you can see just where he was. At this point, Bud spoke up, and he told this story. He said, "You know, you wouldn't believe how many crazies around Apache Junction and these old mountains keep talking about flying saucers." But he made it abundantly clear. He said, "I am not going to tell you that I believe in flying saucers. And I'm not going to tell you that I've seen a flying saucer. So not even drunk or sober, or otherwise. I'll tell you the story, but I don't want you to ever repeat it until after I'm dead and gone. Even if I had wanted to admit it, I would fear people would think that I was just crazy. They'd think I was a lunatic, and I'm not a lunatic." Well, Bud continued the story something like this. He said he was working some stray Mexican steers for Floyd Stone near the upper end of Tortilla Canyon, above Dogie Springs. And now Dogie Springs is about 1.5 miles, 1.75 miles, a little southwest of Tortilla. He was headed back toward the Tortilla Ranch house. Close to dusk, Bud said, "I heard this whining roar that was so loud it was deafening. It even vibrated my lungs. It made my limbs just shake while I sat there on the horse. All of a sudden, back toward Dogie Springs, I saw this object rise into the sky so fast I couldn't recognize what it was." Bud went on to explain that he had ridden all around the area trying to confirm some sort of clues as to what it is he'd seen and what he'd heard. As luck would have it, he found nothing to support what he had seen. Bud said he continued to look around the area every chance he got when he was riding out there chasing after cattle, but he still never found anything. Some 10 or 12 years later, Bud said he was in the area and found an interesting formation on the ground. On the side of a sandy wash, he found a ring of sandy glass about 10 feet in diameter. He was convinced this sandy glass ring wasn't a geological occurrence, but rather he believed the glass ring was formed from sudden extreme heat. The heat, he believed, was produced from a rocket launch of something or other. Well, now, people who knew Bud said he always had been exceptionally truthful. Bud was known to tell tales, as I told you earlier, and he was often used when he'd go on these trips that Billy Crater's Safari Wilderness Trips Corporation would take people out on. And so they could go pretty freelance and tell people pretty much anything they wanted to, and people just ate it up like crazy. Of course, he could stretch the yarn pretty good. Everybody knew that this was another very puzzling and intriguing story that would be impossible to prove unless he could find that glass ring that he was talking about. Bud indicated it was located somewhere near Dogie Springs. Many curious souls have ridden into Dogie Springs over the years, but they found nothing. Tom Jarvis, Maricopa Deputy County Medical Examiner, and Tom Collenborn spent an entire day riding around the area, and they were looking. Bear in mind, we talk about Tom Collenborn an awful lot, but he's probably one of the foremost historians and knowledgeable people about the Superstition Mountains. Ironically, after all of that, several years later, a hiker came to town looking to sell what he said was a piece of melted sand, much like sand that had been melted by a lightning strike. When he told the curious listeners in town that it came from Dogie Springs, everybody's ears perked up. He said it appeared at one time the piece of melted sand or glass had been part of a large circular piece of material. So this guy that nobody knew and had never seen before was coming in, and they were confirming something that Bud had said years before. He further stated that he really didn't know what it was, but he was quite convinced it was part of a lightning strike. That must have been what it was. He gave out directions to the site, but nothing was ever found. And you can rest assured there were lots of folks that got their burros and up the hill they went looking for that glass ring. The story still holds quite a level of curiosity for lots of the MUFON and UFO alien theory folks, mainly because the folks who knew Bud Lane knew he was not prone to tell you a fake story like that. He was around a campfire or similar situation, he might stretch the truth a little bit. But other than that, he was straight as an arrow, and if he said it, you could bank on it. But when it came to this story, he never slacked an inch. And nobody has ever found anything on that doggone ring yet either. It's terrible. And now to close this, so y'all don't think that I'm absolutely out of my mind, as for me, I kept the promise made to Bud Lane. Bud died in 1987. But I still have to wonder sometimes what it was that Bud really did see. Or is this just one more tale that continues to be told that nobody can explain? I don't know either. Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.